Hi, I'm Chris Muchler, Principal Enterprise Architect and VCDX 257 from virtualelephant.com. And in this video, we are going to discuss how you can start designing a cloud architecture as part of a cloud transformation initiative. Let's get started. In this video, I'm going to discuss the 3 phases to creating a cloud architecture that you can leverage as part of a cloud transformation or digital transformation initiative within your organizations. Now, this conversation today is mostly going to focus on the infrastructure side of it and less on the application side. And so as we think about a cloud architecture, what I'm thinking about really is that infrastructure side. Now, again, whether this is infrastructure in a private cloud or data center or colo that you or your company own, or if it's a cloud architecture based off of a public cloud provider and their infrastructure and services that they provide. So the 3 phases are really broken down into the alignment phase, the discovery phase, and the design phase. Now, the alignment phase, what this really should be focused on for you as an enterprise solutions or cloud architect is understanding what the strategic objectives are of your leadership. Now, whether this is leadership at the CIO or CTO level, or perhaps it's leadership at a director or VP of infrastructure layer, you need to understand the direction and the strategic objectives that have been set at a high level. Similarly to what I've discussed in a previous video around aligning the strategic vision with the execution vision, your role as an architect is going to be focused on understanding what are those strategic objectives, strategic business objectives that we are working towards, so that once you have a firm understanding of the overall vision that you're trying to execute on, then you can move into the second phase, which is the discovery phase. It's important to understand the strategic objectives because that's going to drive you in a specific direction during the discovery phase. Now, in this discovery phase, what you're going to want to do or need to do is to gather all of the stakeholders that are going to be involved in this project or this cloud transformation, so that you can begin to gather the requirements that are based off of that strategic direction that you're going towards or moving towards. So once you've gathered a list of names or a group of individuals that are going to make up all of the stakeholders as part of this cloud transformation, now you're going to start to either meet with them as a whole or break them up into individualized groups that have certain focus areas that are in common with one another. And you're going to begin to execute and have actual discovery workshops. Now, in these discovery workshops, you're going to be focused on gathering the requirements, the constraints, identifying some of the larger risks, as well as making some assumptions within that cloud transformation that you're going to base your cloud architecture design on. So you're going to have conversations where you, as the architect, should be leading the conversation and should be asking questions of each of these stakeholders to make sure that you understand what all of the requirements, constraints, risks, and assumptions are around this cloud architecture. It's going to be important to gather all of these requirements, constraints, risks, and assumptions and reviewing them and finding consensus among the broad group of stakeholders. Now, once you've gathered all of these individual items and you've documented them, this is where you're going to move out of the discovery phase and into the design phase. Now, I want to just take a quick minute and note that what we're talking about now in this video is a huge part of the VMware Certified Design Expert or VCDX certification process. If this is a certification that you're working towards, and you know that I'm passionate about it based off of the numerous talks and workshops that I've given and videos that I've created, this is really core. This video is just as applicable to a candidate working towards the VCDX certification as it is to you in the practical application of your job as an architect. And so having these fundamental skills is going to be critical for you as an enterprise cloud or solutions architect. Now, once you've gathered all of the requirements, the constraints, you've identified some risks, but definitely not all of the risks, and you've made assumptions around those requirements and constraints that you've identified, this is where you're going to move into the design phase. Now, moving into the design phase as part of this conversation today around cloud architecture, one of the things that you as an architect are going to need to decide on is what framework are you going to apply? Now, certainly there's the VCDX framework, which is very much understood in the different areas in which it covers. There's also the AWS well-architected framework if you're designing for AWS that you should be leveraging. Regardless of what framework you align yourself to as part of the design portion of creating a cloud architecture, it's important that you cover all of the areas within whatever framework you're working with. Now, the design phase for me, really, I break it into three holistic areas. First, we have the very high-level conceptual design. Then we have the mid-level logical design. And then we have the low-level physical design. Now, the physical design is going to look different whether or not you're doing a private cloud or a public cloud. In a public cloud, you're not necessarily going to worry about things like the physical network topology. But if you're designing a cloud architecture for a private cloud that's on-prem in a colo or in a data center that your organization or company owns, that might be an area that you're going to have to cover within this broader cloud architecture that you're creating. So again, understanding the scope of what you're designing for is going to be important. And hopefully you've gathered enough information both in the alignment and in the discovery phase to understand what is going to be in scope for this design phase that you're now executing against. Now, when we think about that high-level conceptual part of the design that you're going to be creating, this is really going to be broad in the sense that it's really mostly going to align with what you're trying to capture or create based off of those strategic objectives that you discovered or identified in that alignment phase. Now, the logical level, moving down from that conceptual high-level design, is really going to be focused more on what you are trying to offer, perhaps from a services-based architecture that you're going to be delivering up to your end users, whether those end users are individual engineers or engineering teams within your company, or actually external users of your service. Now, the conceptual design is really where you should start to leverage the cloud operating model and understanding how that cloud operating model is going to be applicable to this cloud architecture that you're delivering. Because in today's environment that we find ourselves, I believe that the cloud operating model and any cloud architecture that I'm going to create really need to be married with one another. Because when I think of a cloud architecture, what I'm really thinking about is how am I delivering a set of services based off of that cloud operating model and the layers that we discussed in it in a previous video. And I'll link to that video above. So now at this logical level, the other thing that you're going to be working on is now you as the architect are going to begin making some design decisions based off of those requirements, constraints, assumptions, and risks that you identified in phase 2. Now, these design decisions need to encapsulate a number of things within them for each design decision. First and foremost, every design decision that you make as part of this cloud architecture should be specifically aligned to at least one requirement that you identified in the discovery phase. Now, many requirements will require multiple design decisions, and that's okay. But each individual design decision that you make, first and foremost, again, should be aligned to at least one requirement. And then when you're making the design decision, some of the things that you as the architect should be thinking through are what are the implications of this design decision I've made? How is it going to affect the SREs? How might it affect how an engineer is consuming the service? Once you've identified those implications, then what you want to also be considering is what risks does this design decision potentially introduce? And if it does introduce some sort of risk, then you need to identify some sort of risk mitigation, whether it's a plan, whether it's just going to be accepted, whatever it might be, you need to, for each risk you've identified, come up with a mitigation for it. So once you've identified the requirements that you're meeting and the implications of that design decision, as well as the risks and the risk mitigation, the other thing that I highly encourage you to consider is what other alternatives did you consider before making this design decision and documenting those. As I've said in the past, a design decision is not set in stone. It could change over time. The requirements could change. A new risk could be identified. A business priority could change, which would filter down to new requirements or new constraints placed on your cloud architecture. And so documenting the alternatives that you did consider when you initially made this design decision can help yourself or other architects who might come in after the fact understand better why you made the decision that you made. And being able to critically think through the alternatives will, I believe, make you a better architect in the long run. So once you've come up with a set of design decisions, and again, you're going to make sure that you have design decisions ultimately for every requirement that you identified in that discovery phase. And you're more than likely going to have a variety of categories that you are making design decisions against. Now, if you're using the VCDX framework for this cloud architecture that you're creating, and I would argue that the VCDX framework as a whole is extremely applicable whether you're doing private or public cloud, that it provides a framework that is applicable to all. Now, the VCDX framework is going to cover a variety of areas that you should have requirements based on. Things like recoverability, manageability, availability, performance, security, and possibly even sustainability. And I know that the AWS well-architected framework has similar categories that you're going to want to align to. And so that's going to give you a good basis for which to work against as you create this cloud architecture, making sure that you've made design decisions that are attached to requirements that then tie back to one of these design categories that we've talked about. So once you've reviewed all of your requirements and you've made sure that there is at least one corresponding design decision that you've made as part of this cloud architecture, it's going to be on you to make sure that you've covered everything and that all of the requirements are met. Now, one of the next things that I would highly encourage you to do, whether this is a formal or informal process within your company, is to gather a group or at least one other peer who is an architect to review all of these design decisions that you've made, to review with them all of the requirements that you've identified, all of the risks you've identified, and hopefully subsequently mitigated as part of this product that you've created, this cloud architecture design document ultimately. And you're going to want to go through some sort of review board process with a group of individuals so that you can all come to a consensus that, yes, this cloud architecture that you've designed will meet ultimately these strategic business objectives and all of the requirements and so forth that the stakeholders have identified. Because ultimately, that's the goal. We should be developing an architecture, a cloud architecture, through a set of design decisions that we've made that is going to deliver some entity or service at the end of it that is going to meet those strategic objectives that our CIO or CTO have set forth for us. So this is the process that I go through. Again, alignment of the business and strategic objectives with the leadership, discovery of all of the requirements and constraints and assumptions and risks with the key stakeholders, and then finally the design phase and aligning to a framework and making sure that I've made design decisions and documented those design decisions against all of the requirements and other items that I've identified during that discovery phase. So this is how I do it, and this would be a way that I would recommend that you, as a cloud or solutions or even enterprise architect, execute or create a cloud architecture. As always, if you're enjoying this content that I've created, please make sure that you subscribe to the Virtual Elephant YouTube channel, you turn on notifications, and you leave me a comment below. I'm also available on X or Twitter at Chris Mutchler. Please feel free to reach out to me there and let me know what you thought of this video. Or if you'd like to have a more in-depth conversation, feel free to DM me on that platform. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you next time.